Hello and welcome. My name is Meepolis, they, she, he, and as the title indicates, we are looking back today on my fourth quarter of Not Comics reading, starting out with mini reviews, then a brief overview of how my goals went, and then finally the stats, which we'll be looking at this quarter as well as the year overall, combined with some comparison to last year, with graphs! As usual, there will be timestamps in the description for your navigating convenience. Starting with my lowest rated books for this quarter, we're starting strong with a 1-star review. A goal read, I picked up The Descendants by Cowhart Hemmings because it was feeling like I was running out of options for my goal reading that I was particularly interested in, and it sounded okay. Published in 2007, it was 283 pages long. It has also been adapted into a major motion picture. The summary is, quote, Matthew King was once considered one of the most fortunate men in Hawaii. His missionary ancestors who came to the islands were financially and culturally progressive. One even married a Hawaiian princess, making Matt a royal descendant and one of the state's largest landowners. But now his luck has changed. His 2 daughters are out of control. 10-year-old Scotty has a smart-ass attitude and a desperate need for attention, and 17-year-old Alex, a former model, is a recovering drug addict. His thrill-seeking and high-maintenance wife, Joni, lies in a coma after a boat racing accident and will soon be taken off life support. The King family can hardly picture life without their charismatic mother, but as they come to terms with this tragedy, their sadness is mixed with a sense of freedom that shames them and spurs them into surprising actions. End quote. I initially rated this audiobook 2 stars, but the parts that stuck with me just started to feel really gross, so I did end up shaving the rating down to 1 star. Overall, a decently written book. The major issue I took with it was the way that Matthew thinks about his daughter's puberty and sexual relationships with other people. It just left me feeling very gross. And the book overall didn't seem like it did very well by any of its female characters. The way Hemmings depicts the family in the book's relationship with indigeneity also struck me as a bit odd. The next entry in this mini review go-through was actually 3 books in a series, and that would be Sabriel, Lyriel, and Abhorsen by Garth Nix, who is an Australian author. I had previously read Sabriel as a young adult and always meant to read more of them. That said, TLDR, found them rather meh. That said, rather than really digging into more about these books, I would prefer to highlight the As of Writing This ongoing strike by HarperCollins employees, because while the audiobooks were published by Books on Tape, a Penguin Random House imprint, the books and ebooks are being published by HarperCollins. So it didn't feel appropriate to review them, because while they don't want people to stop reading HarperCollins books, generally they have asked the reviewers withhold their reviews. I'll link to the HarperCollins Union Linktree, where you can read their open letter, check out their page on bookshop.org, donate to the strike fund, and find graphics to show your support. Perhaps a bit outdated at this point, but as of me writing this down, the latest information on their Twitter timeline is, quote, 8 New York senators sent a letter to Brian Murray calling on HarperCollins to negotiate in good faith. End quote. And support from Catherine Applegate of Animorphs fame, Aisha Harris, and Gianna Cadlick, among many others. So definitely check that out. I believe this is the only unionized major American publisher. I also read, but have not entered it into Goodreads yet, Women Eating by Claire Coda, also published by HarperCollins, but not a goal read. Wrapping up my 3-star reviews, we have When the Sahara Was Green, How Our Greatest Desert Came to Be by Martin Williams, published in 2021. It is 240 pages long. Obviously not about Oceania. Martin Williams is employed by the University of Adelaide, so this was a goal read. Quote, The Sahara is the largest hot desert in the world, equal in size to China or the United States, yet this arid expanse was once a verdant, pleasant land populated by rivers and lakes. The Sahara sustained abundant plant and animal life, such as the Nile perch, turtles, crocodiles, and hippos, and attracted prehistoric hunters and herders. What transformed this land of lakes into a sea of sand? When the Sahara Was Green describes the remarkable history of Earth's greatest desert, including why its climate changed, the impact this had on human populations, and how scientists uncovered the evidence of these extraordinary events. End quote. Uninteresting enough read. Unsurprisingly, this book was written from an outsider perspective. Then, moving along to the bulk of my reads, which were in the 4 and 5-star range. My only 4-star not goal read was The Sum of Us by Heather McGee, published in 2021. It is 448 pages long. Summary, quote, Heather McGee's specialty is the American economy and the mystery of why it so often fails the American public. From the financial crisis to rising student debt to collapsing public infrastructure, she found a common root problem: racism. But not just in the most obvious indignities for people of color, racism has costs for white people too. It is a common denominator of our most vexing public problems, the core dysfunction of our democracy, and constitutive of the spiritual and moral crisis that grips us all. But how does this happen, and is there a way out? McGee embarks on a deeply personal journey across the country from Maine to Mississippi to California, telling what we lose when we buy into the zero-sum paradigm, the idea that progress for some of us must come at the expense of others. Along the way, she meets white people who confide in her about losing their homes, their dreams, and their shots at better jobs to the toxic mix of American racism and greed. This is the story of how public goods in this country, from parks and pools to functioning schools, have become private luxuries, of how unions collapsed, wages stagnated, and inequality increased, and how this country, unique among the world's advanced economies, has thwarted universal health care. End quote. Interesting and informative. I ended up a little blasé about the somewhat overused calls to vote ourselves out of the problems that plague so-called America. Looking at my 4-star goal reads, after thinking that I would have to read 1,000,000 Garth Nix books to finish my goal, I was glad to find some other books by authors from that part of the world. First off, let's talk about Fairest, a memoir by Meredith Talusan. Published in 2020, this book is 310 pages long. Summary, quote, Fairest is a memoir about a precocious boy with albinism, a, quote, sunchild from a rural Philippine village who would grow up to become a woman in America. Coping with the strain of parental neglect and the elusive promise of U.S. citizenship, Tillotson found childhood comfort from her devoted grandmother, a grounding force as she was treated by others with special preferences or public curiosity. As an immigrant to the United States, Tillotson came to be perceived as white. An academic scholarship to Harvard provided access to elite circles of privilege, but required Talusan to navigate through the complex spheres of race, class, sexuality, and her place within the gay community. She emerged as an artist and an activist questioning the boundaries of gender. Talusan realized she did not want to be confined to a prescribed role as a man, and her decision to become a woman, despite the risk of losing a man she deeply loved. Throughout her journey, Talusan shares poignant and powerful episodes of desirability and love that will remind readers of works such as Call Me By Your Name and Giovanni's Room. Her evocative reflections will shift our own perceptions of love, identity, gender, and the fairness of life. End quote. A really engrossing read. I appreciated Meredith's willingness to talk about issues of race, nationality, disability, and class as they have intersected with her life in strange and unexpected ways. Then we have Trauma Cleaner by Sarah Krasnostein, published in 2018. It is 291 pages long. Summary, quote, husband, father, drag queen, sex worker, wife, Sarah Krasnostein's The Trauma Cleaner is a love letter to an extraordinary, ordinary life. In Sandra Pankhurst, she discovered a woman capable of taking a lifetime of hostility and transphobic abuse and using it to care for some of society's most in-need people. Sandra Pankhurst founded her trauma cleaning business to help people whose emotional scars are written on their houses. End quote. Another outsider perspective, my feeling after finishing this book was that Krasnostein, rather than holding her subject up as an oddity to be gawked at, tried to bring someone who many might assume at first glance is an outsider into the fold by building Sandra Pankhurst up as a strong and capable survivor and community builder who is very much worth writing about. It was also an interesting crash course in the history of what it has meant to be a white trans woman in Australia in recent history, which is obviously similar but also different from over here in so-called North America. My final 4-star goal read for this quarter was Arsenic and Adobo by Mia P. Manansala, published in 2021. It is 336 pages long. Quote, when Leela moves back home to recover from a horrible breakup, her life seems to be following all the typical rom-com tropes. She's tasked with saving her Tito Rosie's failing restaurant, and she has to deal with a group of matchmaking aunties who shower her with love and judgment. But when a notoriously nasty food critic, who happens to be her ex-boyfriend, drops dead moments after a confrontation with Leela, her life quickly swerves from a Nora Ephron romp to an Agatha Christie case. With the cops treating her like she's the one and only suspect, and the shitty landlord looking to finally kick the family out and resell the storefront, Leela's left with no choice but to conduct her own investigation. Armed with the nosy Auntie network, her barista best bud, and her trusted Joshund, Leela takes on this tasty, twisted case and soon finds her own neck on the chopping block. End quote. I'm not usually into murder mysteries, but this year I have proven very weak against the siren's call of cozy mysteries, mostly on TV, but now also in print, I guess. This proved to be pretty fun to read, and I'll probably pick up the sequels this year. Going back to my not goal reads, I think because I was so focused on reading to finish my goal for this year, many of my not goal reads ended up being 5-star reads. To start out with, we have The Viral Underclass, The Human Toll When Inequality and Disease Collide by Stephen W. Thrasher, published in 2022. It is 352 pages long. Summary, quote, from the preeminent LGBTQ scholar and social critic and journalist Stephen W. Thrasher comes a powerful and crucial exploration of one of the most pressing issues of our time: how viruses expose the fault lines of society. Having spent a groundbreaking career studying the rationalization, policing, and criminalization of HIV, Dr. Thrasher has come to understand a deeper truth at the heart of our society, that there are vast inequalities in who is able to survive viruses, and that the ways in which viruses spread, kill, and take their toll are much more dependent on social structures than they are on biology alone. Told through the heart-rending stories of friends, activists, and teachers navigating novel coronavirus, HIV, and other viruses, Dr. Thrasher brings the reader with him as he delves into the viral underclass and lays bare its inner workings. In the tradition of Isabel Wilkerson's Caste and Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, the viral underclass helps us understand the world more deeply by showing the fraught relationship between privilege and survival. End quote. I picked this book up because Stephen W. Thrasher did a bunch of interviews on podcasts I follow, and his books sounded really interesting. Based on my rating, you can probably guess that it lived up to the hype. I appreciated this clear-eyed and historically knowledgeable look at an issue that I only became aware of when COVID hit. Then we had Making Love with the Lamb by Joshua Whitehead, published in 2022. It is 232 pages. Summary, quote, in Making Love with the Land, his first nonfiction book, Whitehead explores the relationship between body language and land through creative essay, memoir, and confession. In prose that is evocative and sensual, unabashedly queer and visceral, raw and autobiographical, Whitehead writes of an indigenous body in pain, coping with trauma, deeply rooted within. He reaches across the anguish to create a new form of storytelling he calls biostory, beyond genre and entirely sovereign. Through this native perspective, Making Love with the Land recasts mental health struggles and our complex emotional landscapes from a nefarious parasite on his and our well-being to kin, even a relation, no matter what difficulties they present to us. Whitehead ruminates on loss and pain without shame or ridicule, but rather highlights waypoints for personal transformation. Written in the aftermath of heartbreak, before and during the pandemic, Making Love with the Land illuminates this present moment in which both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people are rediscovering old ways and creating new ones about connecting with and responsibility towards each other and the land. Intellectually audacious and emotionally compelling, Whitehead shares his devotion to the world in which we live and brilliantly, even joyfully, maps his experience on the land that has shaped stories, histories, and bodies from time immemorial. End quote. A bit of a sheeple on this point, I read Whitehead's award-winning queer literary fiction, Johnny Appleseed, and enjoyed it, so when I saw this in my library's new acquisitions, I knew I had to pick it up. It did not disappoint. My next 5-star read was also a find from browsing my library's new acquisitions, I believe. I didn't see the full title at first, but the cover intrigued me, and it was an easy sell from there. But yes, Belly of the Beast by Deshaun Harrison was awesome. Published in 2021, it is 256 pages long. Summary, quote, exploring anti-fatness and anti-blackness at the intersections of race, police, violence, gender identity, fatness, and health. To live in a body both fat and black is to intersect at the margins of a society that normalizes anti-fatness as anti-blackness, hyper-policed by state and society, passed over for housing and jobs, and derided and misdiagnosed by medical professionals. Fat black people in the United States are subject to culturally sanctioned discrimination, abuse, and trauma. In Belly of the Beast, author Deshaun Harrison, a fat, black, disabled, and non-binary writer, AMAB, assigned male at birth, offers an incisive, fresh, and precise exploration of anti-fatness as anti-blackness, foregrounding the state-sanctioned murder of Eric Garner in a historical analysis of the policing disenfranchisement, invisibilizing of fat black men, and trans and non-binary AMAB people. Harrison discusses the pervasive, insidious way that anti-fat, anti-blackness shows up in everyday life. Fat people can be legally fired in 49 states for being fat. They're more likely to be houseless. Fat people die at a higher rate from misdiagnosis or non-treatment. Fat women are more likely to be sexually assaulted, and at the intersection of fatness, race, disability, and gender identity, these abuses are exacerbated. Taking on desirability politics, fuckability, healthism, hypersexualization, invisibility, and the connections between anti-fatness and police violence, Harrison viscerally and vividly illustrates the myriad harms of anti-fat, anti-blackness, and offers strategies for dismantling denial, unlearning the cultural programming that says fat is bad, and moving beyond the world we have now towards one that makes space for the fat and black. End quote. Then we had an anthology collection that took me a few checks out to get through, but was well worth it. Non-Binary Memoirs of Gender and Identity, edited by Micah Ruzhanov and Scott Duane, published in 2019. It is 286 pages long. I wasn't too sure about this anthology at first, and I felt a bit on guard, but overall I would say this collection manages to include a lot of diversity when it comes to age and race, and after the first little while it does break out of just being coming out stories too. The one drawback was that you have the same narrator throughout, so I sometimes didn't notice when we switched into a new story. Summary, quote, what happens when your gender doesn't fit neatly into the categories of male or female? Even mundane interactions like filling out a form or using a public washroom can be a struggle when these designations prove inadequate. In this groundbreaking book, 30 authors highlight how our experiences are shaped by deeply entrenched gender binary. The powerful first-person narratives of this collection show us a world where gender exists along a spectrum, a web, multidimensional space. Nuanced storytellers break away from mainstream portrayals of gender diversity, cutting across lines of age, race, ethnicity, ability, class, religion, family, and relationships. From Susie, who wonders whether she'll ever feel like a woman after living 50 years as a man, to Aubrey, who grew up in a cash-strapped fundamentalist household, to Sand, who must reconcile their dual roles of trans advocate and therapist. The writer's conceptions of gender are inextricably intertwined with broader systemic issues, labeled gender outlaws, gender rebels, genderqueer, or simply human. The voices in non-binary illustrate what life could be if we allowed the rigid categories of man and woman to loosen and bend. They speak to everyone who has questioned gender or has paused to wonder, what does it mean to be a man or a woman, and why do we care so much? End quote. My final two reads for December were more random and short pickups that I discovered over Christmas vacation. Overall, great easy reads I would highly recommend. First off was Here in Harlem, Poems in Many Voices by Walter Dean Myers, published in 2004. It is only 88 pages long. Summary, quote, acclaimed writer Walter Dean Myers celebrates the people of Harlem with these powerful and soulful first-person poems in the voices of the residents who make up the legendary neighborhood. Basketball players, teachers, mail carriers, jazz artists, maids, veterans, nannies, students, and more. Exhilarating and electric, these poems capture the energy of resilience of a neighborhood and a people. End quote. As someone who keeps meaning to return to A Contract with God by Will Eisner, the way Eisner profiles people across time in one narrow space has always really intrigued and inspired me. So while Here in Harlem is a very different thing, this idea of building out a neighborhood through its characters tied to a real place made me feel like I needed to immediately jump on this one. And unlike my last recommendation, this audiobook is in beautiful full cast audio. It was a delight to listen to. And finally, while I do have a couple more goal reads to talk about, Potlatch as a Pedagogy, Learning Through Ceremony by Sarah Florence Davidson and Robert Davidson was the very last book I read in 2022. Published in 2018, this was another fast read at 96 pages long. Summary, quote, in 1884, the Canadian government enacted a ban on the potlatch, the foundational ceremony of the Haida people. The tradition which determined social structure, transmitted cultural knowledge, and redistributed wealth was seen as a cultural impediment to the government's aim of assimilation. The tradition did not die, however. The knowledge of the ceremony was kept alive by the elders through other events until the ban was lifted. In 1969, a potlatch was held. The occasion, the raising of a totem pole carved by Robert Davidson, the first the community had seen in close to 80 years. From then on, the community publicly reclaimed from the elders who remained to share it, the knowledge that has almost been lost. Sarah Florence Davidson, Robert's daughter, would become an educator. Over the course of her own education, she came to see how the traditions of the Haida, practiced by her father, holistic, built on relationships, practical and continuous, could be integrated into contemporary education practices. From this realization, the roots for this book. End quote. As a white person who was raised largely far from family and with very little culture, I found it extremely interesting to read a book about how Davidson's community reclaimed their culture and how it got passed down during different points of colonization. Not that I'm going to steal Haida culture. My fellow settler colonizers are to blame for why so many people indigenous to Turtle Island were genocided and their culture legally banned. But yeah, very rich and interesting on many levels. Let's get reparations and land back, etc. to the indigenous people, yeah? Circling back to my final two goal reads, these were also fairly crowning achievements for the year. For Nona the Ninth by Tamsin Muir, I initially thought I would not get the hold in before the end of the year. But then I think my library got some more copies, so I was able to get through the line well in time. Published in September 2022, it was 480 pages long. Looking back through the reviews of the Locked Tomb books 1 and 2, I was somewhat relieved to not be the only one more than a little confused. So yeah, needless to say, I will be revisiting the series again in ideally the near future to see if things fit a bit better together knowing the end. This third and final book did feel like it helped me contextualize things a bit more, which did raise my enjoyment despite my satisfaction with riding the vibes in book 2. Summary, quote, her city is under siege, the zombies are coming back, and all Nona wants is a birthday party. In many ways, Nona is like other people. She lives with her family, has a job at her local school, and loves walks on the beach and meeting new dogs. But Nona's not like other people. 6 months ago, she woke up in a stranger's body, and she's afraid she might have to give it back. The whole city is falling to pieces. A monstrous blue sphere hangs on the horizon, ready to tear the planet apart. Blood of Eden forces have surrounded the last cohort facility and wait for the Emperor Undying to come calling. Their leaders want Nona to be the weapon that will save them from the 9 houses. Nona would prefer to live an ordinary life with the people she loves, with Pura and Camilla and Palamedes, but she also knows that nothing lasts forever. And each night, Nona dreams of a woman with a skull-painted face. End quote. If you happen to know of a video that quickly explains all the plot points of this series, though, I will literally love you forever. And finally, the last book we will talk about today is The White Girl by Toni Birch, published in 2019. It is 272 pages long. Kind of the light doppelganger to The Descendants, the way that Birch builds out the small country town world of Odetta Brown and her granddaughter, Sissy, was so skilled. These are real people jumping off the page. Odette is smart, hardworking, and determined to make a life for herself despite Australia's genocide of Aboriginal people. Instead of awkwardly sexualizing the female characters, Birch is able to have his grandmother character be concerned about her daughter and granddaughter growing up and the threat posed by the predatory white men around them without turning her children into exotic sexual objects. Birch also seamlessly interweaves story with the hard-hitting facts of Australia's eugenics-laden history and avoids inspiration porn. Summary, quote, Odette Brown has lived her whole life on the fringes of a small country town. Her daughter disappeared and left her with her granddaughter, Sissy, to raise on her own. Odette has managed to stay under the radar of the welfare authorities who are removing fair-skinned Aboriginal children from their families. When a new policeman arrives in town determined to enforce the law, Odette must risk everything to save Sissy and protect everything she loves. In The White Girl, Miles Franklin shortlisted author Tony Birch shines a spotlight on the 1960s and the devastating government policy of taking Indigenous children from their families. End quote. Which concludes the very mini and bite-sized reviews of the books that I read. I never aspired to review these not comics as much as my comics. That's not what I'm here for, but I do hope that one of these quarters I will keep more timely notes and not leave writing this until the last minute. Moving along to wrapping up my goals for 2022, I did pretty well overall on book goals, but failed completely on personal goals because I didn't write them down anywhere else. Bumping my yearly goal on Goodreads up to 100 has been nice, and I did manage to read 31 books out of the 30 from Oceania, islands of Southeast Asia, and Pacific Islands, which was really gratifying because it often felt like there was a bit of a dearth of audiobooks from that region at my library. This also marks the third year that I succeeded at this sort of not comics goal after several years of intentions that generally fell a bit short. And while I don't have much not bookish content to offer this quarter, check out previous quarter wrap-ups from Movie Recs. I did come across one podcast episode that covers a really interesting conversation going on in Australia, namely PRX's The Stoop did an episode on reclaiming Black in Australia. Link in the description to that. We're just going to skip the personal goals section, red X's all around. But before we conclude this section, in case the algorithm didn't serve it up to you already, check out last week's video, 2023 reading goals. Now on to the pretty stats part of this video. Usual asterisk that this is all based on very general searches via DuckDuckGo. I'm not really interested in pinning down everyone I read into little category boxes, and sometimes people count in more than one category. There is also sometimes called to go back and add information or correct misinformation. And finally, sometimes more than one category applies, and in cases of anthologies, I only count points of identity that are shared by all the contributors. Looking at total books read, this fourth quarter was once again my lowest quarter, which was the same last year, which was the first year that I broke my reading down by quarter. This quarter, I was also sick several times, and Livy has started not letting me load up downloaded audiobooks if I'm not on Wi-Fi, which is very annoying. I'm not at all surprised my not comics reading was lower than last year, 102 compared to 89, as my total reading was also down a bit. Not terribly surprised as life in the COVID pandemic has gotten a bit busier as the world around us has decided to let her rip. I finally added a tab in my spreadsheet to compare totals for the now 6 years that I've been tracking my not comics reading like this, which does assure me that the average trend is still upward. Although who knows what 2023 will bring as far as disruption to my routine, so I'm going to try and not yoke my self-esteem too closely to how many things I read in a year. Average pages per book this quarter did tick up slightly from last quarter, but looking at my year overall, I continue to average somewhere in the high 200s. I'm pretty comfortable with this spot, even though it does feel a bit low, just because I do feel like I hit up a mix of long and short books. Average publication year this quarter jumped up to 2016, but overall the average for 2022 was only 2005. Which is generally about where my reading has lingered for the last few years, with the exception of last year, that averaged 2010. Average star ratings was very unsurprising. I averaged 4 stars this past quarter, and for the year overall, which was the same as last year. Woot! On the other hand, I do have some internal angst brewing about maybe rating books too highly, but I also feel like I've gotten much better at picking out books that I really want to read, so I guess I will continue to try and force myself to feel like things are balanced out. And maybe I'll create an updated how I rate books video? ? Moving right along to series versus standalone reads, this was one area that I had a last-minute epiphany on and decided to add a new column for tracking books in a series that are not the first book in a series. We all talk about starting too many series and not ever finishing them, so this seemed like an addition that might possibly help with that. Maybe next year I'll also add a last book in the series column so I can track that better as well. Graphs are still just series versus standalone. This fourth year I read 5 books that were part of a series, the same as quarters 1 and 2 actually, versus 10 standalone. A bit lower than usual, but still proportional to my general reading trends. This year overall, I read 22 series books and 61 standalone, which lines up very closely to my reading last year. Looking at genre, this past quarter I read my first straight-up mystery novel. Probably not ever, although nothing is coming to mind, but the first since I started tracking genres here. So in total, I read 7 nonfiction, 3 contemporary, 4 science fiction fantasy, 1 mystery, and 1 poetry. A pretty good spread, if I do say so myself. Looking at the demographics of who books that I read were geared towards, the most surprising thing was that I read no middle grade this quarter, which has been a growing habit for me to try and touch on every once in a while. My YA reading was also a bit down to 3, with adults as usual being the largest demographic at 12. Overall, in 2022, I read 5 middle grade, 12 YA, and 69 adult books, which saw a small increase in middle grade over last year, even as the other 2 demographics ticked down a bit because I read less. Looking at the politics of the books I read this quarter, I read 1 book by an avowed communist. Otherwise, things were pretty nebulous. This year overall, I read 2 books by anarchists, 5 books by communists, and 2 by people who wandered around the left for a while, which did trend up a bit from last year, particularly when you consider I read less. Next up, as I've tried to track since last year, I try to mark down when I read a book by someone who IDs in the disabled, deaf, neurodivergent, and or mental health struggles space, as compared to everyone who does not declare, either because they are in fact perfectly able-bodied or have decided they don't feel like talking about it on the internets, which is fine. Plus, thanks to my own neurodivergency, I sometimes forget the way people ID by the time I add their book to my statistics. This quarter I read 3 books by people who fall somewhere under these identities and 16 people who are unknown. Overall, this year I read 80 books whose status was unknown and 9 that were. This is a bit lower than last year, which I'll need to keep an eye on going forward. Moving along to my statistics around race, this was the biggest issue I ran into with the available selection of goal reads, with 6 white authors, 4 indigenous authors, 3 black authors, 1 otherwise POC author, and 3 books by people who are unknown. Overall, I do think that my consciousness around being sure I'm not reading majority white authors overall is still pretty good, but they certainly make up a disproportional majority of generally available published books. Progress is also never totally linear, so I'll try once again to do better in the coming quarter. Because of a similar shortfall in the second quarter this year, my overall yearly stats are also a bit disproportional as well, with 32 white authors, 18 black authors, 18 indigenous authors, and 16 POC authors, with those same 3 unknown authors there at the end. Of course, last year's reading goal pushed me in a very different direction, with 42 black authors read, 29 white authors, 22 indigenous authors, and 17 otherwise POC authors, and 1 unknown author. Religion-wise, I hit an odd stat this quarter, which was no one being public with their religion or lack thereof, ? Overall this year, I read 10 authors who fell somewhere on the Christian spectrum at some point in their life, 3 by similarly Muslim-influenced authors, 3 by Jewish-influenced authors, 2 books by an author who publicly practices Odinan, and 1 each from other indigenous spiritualities, from Baha'i, atheist, and 1 author whose family converted into Scientology. Looking at gender, this quarter I read books by 6 female authors, 9 by male authors, 3 by non-binary authors, and 1 by a two-spirit author. Side note, I also read 3 books by trans authors. Overall, this evened out to fairly average in the year overall, with 46 female authors, 33 male authors, 9 books by non-binary authors, and 1 book by a two-spirit author. Of this total, 8 people also identified as trans. Looking at the rest of the queer spectrum this quarter, I read 6 authors who were out of the closet and 11 authors who are unknown. Proportionally 14% higher than my yearly average, with a total of 19 out authors and 68 unknown. And with last year's obviously falling somewhere in the middle. And winding down a bit, but not wrapping up completely, I did find another new thing to introduce here at the last minute, and that is looking at how many books I read and how many are from the big 5 publishers. For this comparison, I did end up going through my entire 2022, but I did not have the energy to go back and do 2021. so it'll be a bit of a limited comparison this time around. Since I mostly listen to audiobooks, I've gone back through Libby to find all the publication information. I've also made a new tab that outlines all the different imprints for each of the big 5 publishers as I find them. I'm pretty sure I caught them all, but there may be a small margin of error for this initial go around because not all imprints are super transparent. This final quarter I read one book that was published as an audiobook by HarperCollins, see earlier point about the strike, 1 by Macmillan, 8 by Penguin Random House, and 8 from other publishers. Looking at the year overall, I read 5 books from Hachette Book Group, 11 from HarperCollins, 8 from Macmillan, 26 from Penguin Random House, 3 from Simon & Schuster, 5 that were generally in the public domain, and 28 published by other companies. I think the biggest surprise for me was just how many Penguin Random House books I read. That is interesting. Looking next at language and geography, I didn't read a Witcher book this quarter, so that equaled 0 translated lit. Looking at the breakdown of what countries authors I read were from, we had 8 connected to the so-called USA, 3 connected to so-called Canada, 2 Haida authors, and 6 authors connected to, honestly, let's just call it so-called Australia. As far as countries and groups that I only read 1 book from, an author connected to them, I read 5 in total, including Cree, Ojibwe, so-called New Zealand, and the Philippines, and the UK. And looking at the year as a whole, I did manage to read 4 translated works, and not all of them were The Witcher, so even better. Of the countries and tribes connected to people whose books I read 38 from the so-called USA, 19 from so-called Canada, 2 by Cree authors, 2 from Haida authors, 3 Métis, 3 Ojibwe, 3 from so-called Australia, 2 from Egypt, 2 from Igbo authors, 4 authors connected to India, 2 from Indonesia, 4 from the Philippines, 3 from Poland, and 5 from the UK. Countries and tribes that I only read 1 book from each were Haudenosaunee, Inuk, Brazil, Bundjalung, China, Eritrea, Ethiopia, France, Germany, Hui, Japan, Pakistan, Palestine, Sudan, and Wik peoples. This is by far the most unwieldy stat, but it's certainly interesting. And spoiler, since I'm hitting on my final geographic focus this year, my current plan is for next to try and circle back and read at least 30 books from places and people who I have not read from previously. That's all they wrote. Bye y'all, keep reading, and organized to end capitalist oppression.